Hello, and thank you very much for coming along to Eco Views and News. This evening we want to touch upon another in the series of Grassroots Global. That is the connection between grassroots leaders and activists and their global vision. You'll remember in the last few sessions we've been dealing with a number of these people nationwide. There are quite a few who are out there and have been quite active, but they're not in the mainstream press usually, and in fact you have to follow them fairly closely, either in talks they give or articles they write, because they're not given prominence in what we usually get across television or the mainstream media. Today I want to focus particularly upon Dr. William Moomaw, who in fact teaches up at Tufts University, but it has a great long history of working on climate issues that we should touch upon. Now, you recall we started talking a while back about leaders who, in a sense, got out there and got arrested for the cause, like Gus Speth, who stood side to side, shoulder to shoulder with Bill McKibben down in Washington, and emphasized that it's time to go into some new phase with bringing public attention to these issues. He was former dean of the Yale Forestry School, and he's stepped up to take an active role. Bill McKibben himself, you've heard from several times, and we focused on a Grassroots Global profile of him, as well as Dr. James Hansen, who was among the first to issue the nationwide warning about these things. In fact, you may recall that it was his testimony on this famous panel back on the 23rd of June in 1988 that made the case very clearly, and because it was made so strongly, it was focused upon by the news media. It's worth recalling the exact wording that he used in that panel at the time. We can hear it. And if we call it up, notice how, in fact, it's been reported in the media since, and in fact, a matter of great concern, because 25 years ago he predicted on June 23rd, in the middle of the year, he predicted that 1988 would be the hottest year on the climate record for the United States. He proved to be true then, and he's been true ever since in a lot of his statements. Listen to how he put it then.
Barring a remarkable and improbable cooling, 1988 will be the warmest year on the record. Altogether, this evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
Okay, the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now. 1988, 25 years ago. This is not widely accepted at the time. But there are other people we should pay attention to on that panel. In fact, it's sometimes thought that he alone said this, and that's not true. If you look at the rest of that panel, in fact, it's quite an impressive array of people. Michael Oppenheimer, there's Dr. George Woodwell sitting there in back of James Hansen, and down here on the end of the panel here, you can see an individual that's really quite interesting. This is the gentleman I want to focus on this evening, Dr. William Moomaw. He was very important in that panel testimony, but even more so since. He's been cited as a very important contributor to what came out of that panel. Now, what did come out of that panel? Well, among other things, Senator Tim Wirth was among the senators who listened to the testimony, Democrat from Colorado, and he went on to invite Professor Moomaw, Dr. Moomaw at that time, to come and speak to a group in Washington. In fact, a group of his own constituents from Colorado, but he called together a Colorado kind of brain trust to have them listen to Dr. William Moomaw. And it was recorded at the time by C-SPAN. You can call it up, look it up, and listen to the whole thing. I'd urge you to do so. He introduces Bill Moomaw quite glowingly. In fact, we'll listen in a second to the introduction. And then Bill Moomaw gets up and gives an extraordinary speech articulating 25 years ago what most of the public is still just catching up to at this point. Tim Wirth was at that point a senator. He then went on to become the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs during the Clinton administration, and he was actually the Undersecretary of State who negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. Al Gore came in and signed it in Kyoto, but the Undersecretary of State in charge of negotiating that was Tim Wirth. So important was the event of introducing Bill to the public and having him hear the wider implications that it's lived on as the Tim and Bill Show. You can probably call it up from the C-SPAN. In its more colloquial form, it's called the Tim and Bill Show. And it's worth listening to Senator Wirth's introduction.
The problem is close enough and severe enough, global warming and so many other issues, that we have a very short period of time in which to act before we cause very significant dangers to the life support systems we were talking about earlier.
Now that in itself is significant. 1988, as a senator, Tim Wirth realizes it's important enough and crucial for the life supporting systems that we've got to get going. There's a window of time he refers to that we have left. Now this is 25 years ago. When you see the progress that hasn't been made in those 25 years, it's possible to get discouraged. But listen to his introduction.
In all of this, there are some people in the country, again, who've been out on the cutting edge scientifically and in a policy fashion. And our speaker today, Bill Moomaw, is one of those. Dr. Moomaw is a graduate of Williams and got his PhD from MIT. He has taught at UCLA and at Tufts, was Fitch Professor of Chemistry and Director of the Environmental Program at Williams College, and is currently the Director of the Climate, Energy, and Pollution Program at the World Resources Institute. It was WRI and the resources that they have brought together who were particularly helpful as we were putting together, starting a year and a half ago, this very ambitious and enormously important global warming legislation. This large bill that WRI helped us to write with the assistance of a number of other groups started a year and a half ago as sort of a thought that, well, let's try to put together what ought to be done. And we have slowly but surely done that. I introduced it last year. There were 12 Senate sponsors, I believe, last year for the legislation. We got comments since the last Congress from all across the country. I reintroduced it again this last January, and we now have 35 members, more than 1/3 of the United States Senate, willing to co-sponsor this legislation, co-author the legislation, put their names on it, and this is not an uncontroversial or easy piece of legislation.
Well, that turns out to be an understatement. He points out that he had the bill introduced first in 1988, 12 co-sponsors. By 1989, largely with the help of Bill Moomaw, as you'll see, that bumps up to 35 senators, more than 1/3 of the Senate. But there's been no progress since Bill left Washington. Listen to the statement, though, about Bill's role in drafting this first piece of legislation.
It is very difficult. The challenges that we face in energy policy, in population policy, in forestation policy, right across the board, so many areas that demand significant change. Each one of those areas is also surrounded by a set of interests who don't want to see change. So the fact that there are 35, more than 1/3 of the members of this body, willing to get on this and willing to say this is important, we want to make that kind of change, is a very significant first legislative step. We could not have done all of this without the assistance of Bill and WRI, and he is one of the people who has thought most clearly for a long period of time about global warming and related international environmental problems. Bill Moomaw.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a very nice introduction, very kind. It's a very distinct pleasure and honor to be able to address a group from Colorado like this. I've unfortunately never had the opportunity to live in Colorado, but I have visited many times and climbed in the mountains there and enjoyed the beauty of that wonderful state. I think that for those of us who live in climates like Colorado, where sometimes the winters can get a little severe, particularly when you get back in the mountains a bit, the notion of global warming may seem like it might be a blessing. Now, of course, you're with the ski industry, you may not feel quite that way, and as many of you may know, New England suffered tremendous economic losses this year with a loss of snow, which may or may not have anything to do with the greenhouse effect, but everybody in New England now ascribes it to the greenhouse effect, whereas a year or two ago they wouldn't even know what the greenhouse effect was. And a large part of the reason for that is that people know about this, of course, is the work that Senator Worth and others have done to make this issue one that is on everybody's agenda, the whole question of global warming. What I'd like to do is to spend at least a few minutes describing for you what the climate change issue is and what it's about and what our role is in that change and what it is that we might be able to do about it.
Okay, well, you'll have to call this up for the full speech. It's worth listening to, definitely. But I want to catch you up on his more recent activities, as it were, since his time at WRI and the famous Tim and Bill show, Tim Worth and Bill Moomaw. He came back up to Boston, actually, and Tufts out in Medford and Somerville, and established the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy as part of the Fletcher School. Here's where you can find he's been teaching for the last 20 years. In fact, he sent this up 20 years ago, and they've just celebrated their 20th anniversary after having worked 25 years ago at WRI with all the support effort given to Senator Worth. Well, for 20 years since then, he's been working at this center, which he founded, created, and is now director of. And from time to time at Harvard, we would invite him down to give seminars. Every once in a while in the Harvard Seminar on Environmental Values series, we had a series on air, breath of life, winds of change, toward a new environmental ethic. And the person who addressed this very effectively that year was Bill Moomaw in a very important paper called Climate Change, the challenge to science, politics, economics, and values. This is appropriate. The seminar was convened by the Harvard Divinity School, and Bill had no fear in coming over after talking to senators in D.C. and setting up his own program for this at the Fletcher School, had no fear in coming over to talking to people at the Divinity School about values questions in reference to climate. He then went on to help found a group called the Climate Talks Project when it was clear that George W. Bush would not sign, in fact unsigned, the Kyoto Protocol. Bill helped sign a project that would help academics get the word out even if our government didn't act. And you can look that up at climate-talks.net and see what they've been up to ever since. One of the things that they've been up to is teaching. And Bill Moomaw has come over after his daily teaching up at the Fletcher School at Tufts. He's come over to Harvard for the night school. And for the last 10 years, he's been teaching a course called Global Climate Change, the Science, Social Impact, and Diplomacy of the World Environmental Crisis. Now, in that process, he's also continued to write a lot, especially for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in that function, he was recognized not long ago, actually, as part of the group that received, along with Al Gore, the co-recipients. So remember, Al Gore received it on the one hand, but also the members of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had numerous members, two of which were at Tufts, Adil Najam and William Moomaw, both of whom worked assiduously on the various drafts of the reports. And when they were nominated and then received the Nobel Peace Prize as co-recipients with Al Gore, they were celebrated up at Tufts at the time. It's appropriate. Not everyone gets an award in metallic form, but it's very appropriate that they should be signaled out as the recipients of this. A number of people on the IPCC group were associated with MIT in one way or another, and in fact MIT assembled a lot of them that were within striking distance not long ago and had them reflect on the nature of the award and talk a little with Rajendra Pachari, the chair of the group, sharing their reflections with the rest of the world through this MIT panel. But Bill was on the panel and offered a number of reflections after introductions by everyone. I'll try to find the spot where Bill starts to speak to give you a sense of his role in this. It's around just about minute 9.5, and we'll try to jump in here. There are others that are speaking as well, and they are making assessments about the hopefulness of things. But here's Bill.
Has lost his way as a professor at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University.
It's been a steep decline, but very interesting. I first worked on a couple of technical reports for IPCC just before the second assessment report. I was a lead author on that, mostly on industrial mitigation. I was a coordinating lead author on the third assessment report on a chapter which had the cumbersome but entitled but important mission of describing the technological and economic potential for emissions reductions, which covered everything. It was transportation, it was power production, it was buildings, agriculture, industry, and so on. And then I was a lead author on this last assessment report on the power sector. And I was also a lead author along with Howard Herzog on the special report on carbon dioxide capture and storage.
Now, once again, I'll let you find the full participation on the panel. I do want to focus a bit on his reflections, as he had worked on that group. He does reflect a bit upon the amazing progress that individuals are making, or local municipalities and towns, even though there doesn't seem to be much progress made at the international level or at the national governmental level. And he's one to look beyond, in a sense, the discouraging non-activity on the international scale and take a look at the encouraging signs on the more local level. Take a look.
Out and hired an MIT graduate engineer who is one of the leading people in energy efficiency in the Northeast, Mark Rosenbaum, to help design a zero net energy home for myself. And it's astounding what is happening in the world. This meeting we were at last week was in Lübeck, Germany, in Schleswig-Holstein. Last year, Schleswig-Holstein produced 39% of its total electricity equivalent by wind power. We're still battling whether or not we can have a few wind turbines out here in Nantucket Sound.
Now, that's it. He's contrasting what's being done elsewhere in the world with what, in effect,
Lübeck, Germany.
isn't happening here. But he's saying, look, don't be discouraged. I hired, and he gives the example, I hired a person to take a look at how I'd build a house here. And sure enough, that's in fact what Bill then does. He turns around and builds his own house to a new kind of specification that's worth looking at in detail here. That is, he's saying not only talk the talk, but let's walk the walk. Let's build a house, a zero net energy house, in one of the coldest towns in all of Massachusetts, Williamstown. And he and his wife set out to design and build from scratch a well-insulated and newly thought-through design with solar panels on the roof, insulation throughout, orientation toward the south, and a very innovative geoengineering project of thermal heat. We went out and documented this from time to time, and it's really quite an impressive achievement. He comes back and talks to it, to this Harvard evening class, and both he and Margot have lectured extensively at the Extension School about this. It's an amazing house. Now that it's completed, gets through all seasons, and in fact has a little pond in front of it that attracts quite a bit of nice wildlife. If you ever get a chance in Williamstown to talk about it with people, they won't be slow. They're in great admiration of it. It has gone through all seasons. He's lived in it for 5 years now, and it's toasty warm inside, no matter how cold it looks outside. It's been written up in various architecture journals, and you can see that Bill's taken on the role, in a sense, of the great American classic art form, known as American Gothic at one point. They've, in effect, become the American classic, Bill and Margot themselves, with a living, a breathing demonstration of Grassroots Global, how the local is related to the global, and through that, to our common play. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next week. Keep in touch online or on air.